Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the final day of the Art Symposium. Our guest this morning is an Islamic art and architecture scholar who is currently a Dean of Faculty and Deputy Head of King's Academy in Madaba, Jordan. He has received his BA in Anthropology in Ohio State University in 1972. Carrying his educational career further, he has also obtained a master's degree in art history that focuses on Byzantine and Islamic art. With his high ambitions, he continued further to obtain a PhD in Islamic art and architecture in the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. He taught in many prestigious universities, including the University of Michigan and Oberlin College. He then moved on to becoming the Dean of Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Jordan. With such high motivations and the willingness to go further in his studies, stopping is not an option. For he has published numerous articles and book chapters based on Islamic architecture, calligraphy, ornaments, and even gardens.
I should give thanks to those who brought me here again, not my camel or horse, but the great organizers of this conference, the brilliant organizers. And I should find ways to reflect on past experience and build upon it. In some respects, this is just what this paper is about, a return to ideas that I rather impressionistically explored back in the early 1990s, but that have since been further explored by Ruggles, Robinson, Koch, and others. At the same time, I'm afraid that the idea still remains larger than its realization, although I've gone further than before in establishing conceptual links between water and poetry. Limited time and maybe waning imagination have conspired to stop me from attaining the goal to the fullest. More remains to be done on both fronts, the poetic and the visual. Having said that, the truth is that I can't be any happier to be taking part in this conference on water, a theme that I have designed as the year's theme at King's Academy, where I am now Deputy Headmaster. In the conclusion of one of the last articles I wrote on the subject on water and gardens, I proposed that a dialectical process may have formed between gardens and garden poetry, such that as gardens and fountains became increasingly viewed in poetic terms, the gardens themselves may have aspired to these literary ideals. Such congruence between the textual and visual is really quite rare in Islamic culture, which, with the exception of calligraphy and maybe later Persian painting, remains rather silent about its physical creations. So its mere existence, I think, deserves closer investigation. By dwelling in this paper on the exchange and interplay between poetry and water, and between poetry on the one hand and water and garden design on the other, I would like to highlight the physical, aesthetic, and to some extent technological aspects of this relationship, and to examine its resonance from pre-Islamic times to approximately the medieval period. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. This holds true for the beloved as it does for water and greenery. The arid climate of the Middle Eastern region led to the great valuation of water, making it a central feature in religious and royal iconography, a subject of poetic contemplation, and an important vehicle for technological innovation, as well as, of course, as the ideal location for picnics and casual lunches. Water and greenery never look more appealing and attractive than when they are projected against the yellowish aridity of most Middle Eastern habitats. It is undoubtedly for that reason that Middle Eastern people, and I would single out people of Greater Syria and Arabia, I suppose, love to gather around water in all its forms: cisterns, pools, dams, streams, rivers, or waterfalls. الماء والخضرة والوجه الحسن are ideals that I suppose are the secular version of وخلقنا من الماء كل شيء حي. وجعلنا, I'm sorry. So for most people, الماء والخضرة والوجه الحسن, water, greenery, and a beautiful face are the perfect companions of a a good meal, I suppose. The situation for nomadic Arabs was somewhat more austere, or a lot more austere. Water was a transient phenomenon, a memory recalled from dried wadis and tumble-down wells. The poetry of Jahili poets invariably spoke of desert travel, love lost, vanished settlements. Nature, even when it existed, was restricted to the immediately observable, the directly tangible. Imru al-Qais, in translation, halt, friends both, let us weep, recalling a love and a lodging. By the rim of the twisted sands between Ad-Dakhul and Hawmal, توضح المقراط, whose trace is not yet effaced for all the spinning of the south winds and the northern blasts. قف نبكي من ذكرى حبيب ومنزلي بسقط اللوى بين الدخول فحوملي فتوضح فالمقراط لم يعفو رسمها لما نسجتها من جنوب وشمالي. Until he goes on to talk about, you may see the dung of antelope spattered like peppercorns. Well, I skipped a line. It doesn't matter. Similar meanings could also be derived from the mu'allaqa of Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma. Here I have يوم ترحلوا. It shows the preparation of a caravan to leave. وإني غداة البين يوم تحملوا لدى سمرات الحي ناقف حنظلي. Speaking about shedding a tear as the caravan is preparing to leave. Zuhair ibn Sulma in his mu'allaqa, he writes, I stood near the encampment of Awfa after an absence of 20 years, and with some effort, I know her abode again after thinking a while. I recognized 3 stones blackened by fire at the place where the kettle used to be, placed at night, and the trench around the encampment which had not burst like the source of a pool. Look, O my friend, do you see any women traveling on camels going over the high ground above the stream of Jurthum? When they arrived at the water, the mass of which was blue from intense purity, they laid down their walking sticks like the dweller who has pitched his tent. That's the second line for the translator, the one that goes, فَلَمَّا وَرَدْنَا الْمَاء. Garden, water, even fertility, only partook of this vision as memories. Here are scattered stones of dried wells. There lies the weathered stakes of a tent. Further on, spread the spattered dung of where animals once grazed. Existing oases are hardly mentioned. Flowing water and irrigated fields are shunned from this vision, as if their mere presence would taint the poet as soft or effeminate, not a true desert dweller. It is undoubtedly a romantic and even romanticized vision, because we know that many of these poets actually spent a good part of their time in and around courts. Yet, it is a vision that was shared, an idealized vision that was shared by both patrons and poets. Islam transformed this memory, the idea of memory, into a promise. The believer was no longer a desert wanderer bemoaning the loss of things past, but became now a believer, a follower of the true path, a path that culminated in paradise. Mentioned about 35 times in the Quran, paradise is depicted as the blissful abode of the righteous believer, elevated chambers that are attended to by huris, gardens beneath which rivers flow, 4 rivers of sacred water, milk, wine, and honey, a shady grove drenched in water and populated by all things of beauty. The images are serene, sensuous, fertile, overwrought, and even unrealistic. Clearly, this is not a normal garden, but the eternal garden of paradise, and its refined imagery was intended to transport the true believer into a world that he or she would inhabit after their passage. More than anything, the Garden of Paradise emerges as nearly the exact opposite of the world that surrounded the Arabs of Arabia. Watered, shady, plentiful, and not quite real. It is not a place in which one lives and through which one walks, but an encompassing image of contemplation and immersion. Of course, like other ancient people, in particular Semites, the pre-Islamic Arabs also believed in the sanctity and curative power of springs, of which, of course, the spring of Zamzam, which has been mentioned more than once near the Kaaba, was the quintessential Muslim spring. This is a tradition that is common in other places, and I show you here in Nasra, Ain al-Adra, the Virgin Spring. It is a tradition that is shared by Muslims and Christian communities, and I will come back to this point later. To summarize then, for the pre-Islamic Arabs, water was a memory. For the Muslims, it was an eternal promise. The question that I would like to ask, therefore, is how, when, and where did this memory become an existential experience? And the promise, when did the promise become a reality? How were these images made real to living Muslims? And where and when did these processes take place? In what ways were these basic images modified by contact with the more established cultures of Mesopotamia, Persia, and Byzantium? How did poetry or prose elevate these physical creations or recreations into metaphorical constructions? What did these human creations mean? Were they simply recreations of paradise, images of power and magnificence, vehicles for agronomic or technological sophistication, or even gardens for the zurafa, the literati, who would grow to populate the social space between separating artists and imperial patrons? Finally, as an historian, I would like to look at these ideas somewhat diachronically in terms of the creation and development in early classical and medieval Islamic poetry. Well, some images on the Mac do not project. Anyway, in many respects, the main religious and secular themes that define the role of water in Islamic society were already explored and predicted in ancient Mesopotamia. I'm not saying, of course, that Muslims came and saw the objects like this or even knew about them. But what I'm suggesting is that the ideas and ideals, the concepts embodied in such objects had already permeated into the consciousness of the people of Mesopotamia and Iran and Syria. I think nothing better illustrates the relationships in which water plays an important role than this important vase, the Uruk vase of the year 3000 BCE. Divided into horizontal registers, it begins, as you see, with streams of water on which plants grow, from which animals graze, which are then turned into the sustenance for humans, and the surplus is made into offerings for the gods and goddesses. And as you see on the top, the offerings are made to the gods. The cycle is only completed by the presence of royal will, which maintains the canals and creates prosperity on the land. Show you at least one other example. There are no evidence of Mesopotamian gardens, but the penchant for the regularization of water channels that will be characteristic of all Middle Eastern gardens, I think, is already present in the way the water channels are regularized in this very important brick relief sculpture currently in Berlin, dated from about 1500 BCE, which shows an alternation of gods and goddesses with streams of water emanating from them. As for the earliest known gardens, pixelated, we must wait for the Achaemenid periods when gardens known from archaeological remains and the descriptions of Greek travelers emerge fully formed as protected enclosures or paradises with cruciform water channels and quadripartite gardens that later would be called the Jaharbar. Although often understood as an image of paradise, I think its links with power are unmistakable. Most clearly visible in the idea of regularization and control of water, and all of it under the gaze of the palace up above. The Umayyad period sort of disrupts this sequence, for despite its many notable religious and palatial creations, Umayyad poetry remains quite silent about these accomplishments. For example, arguably the most interesting depiction, the most literal depiction of the Garden of Paradise in the Great Mosque of Damascus goes virtually unnoticed by contemporary observers. A century later, or a few centuries later, Al-Muqaddasi, describes it, though not in terms of paradise, but as the literal depiction, representation of the palaces of the Umayyads. Possibly one exception in Umayyad poetry, or in the Umayyad period, are the poems written for Al-Walid II, and that seem to engage visual themes in the palace of Khirbat al-Mafjar. But even here, these poems, which were collected by Hamilton, are not really so much about the palace and its pools as they are about the extravagant feasting and drinking that took place in this palace. This changes quite abruptly, rather abruptly, in the Abbasid period, especially in Samarra, where an inordinately large number of palaces, pavilions, and gardens were built during the city's brief existence between 836 and 892. We know from archaeologists of the 20th century and from the poets and the chroniclers who wrote about it, we can draw an impressionistic picture of the palaces and gardens of Samarra. It is only, in fact, under the early Abbasids that poets seem to notice the increasingly elaborate built environment, particularly the palaces of Samarra. One poet wrote, "I see al-Mutawakkiliya has grown in splendor and completion of form. With palaces as shiny as the stars, they would nearly dispel the darkness for the night walker." Something like, "أرى المتوكلية قد اكتملت وأكملت التمام قصورا كالكواكب لامعات يكدن يفتتن للساري الظلامة." The court poetry, Al-Buhturi is a prime example. Although his earlier poems spoke of desert wanderings and his longing for desert life, from about 860 until his death, which postdates the death of Samarra in 892, he wrote several qasidas that adapt, even challenge earlier Nasib, or Weeping by the Ruins, format by including extensive descriptions of the palaces, pools, and gardens of Samarra. A famous panegyric that he wrote, Madih, to Khalifa al-Mutawakkil in 861, comprised 20 lines that describe the Birka al-Ja'fariyya, or Birkat al-Mutawakkil, an artificial pond almost 200 meters per side, created by the caliph in front of one of his many palaces. One of the lines, when the stars gaze at themselves in its side at night, you would think a firmament had been built into it. Those who have studied the poem have dwelled on the contrast made by the poet between the uncontrolled ravages of the natural landscape, which is swept by wind, sand, and rain, and the protected enclosure in which the lake is located. Of course, the lake does not exist, but I'll show you other images of Samarra. So the winds sweeping the encampment of Imru al-Qais and Zuhair ibn Abu Salma only gently caress the surface of this pond, whose permanent presence beautifies and nourishes the surrounding landscape. In the garden and the lake, nature is recreated by the caliph. The creation is beautiful and beyond harm because it is the fruit of his spiritual power and is protected by it. The creation of the caliph therefore supersedes and even transcends nature's creation, making him a visible symbol of the divinely sanctioned ruler and defender of the faith. Beneath his feet, beneath his palace, extend waters that have been shaped and controlled into surfaces and channels that could not be paralleled in the natural world. In shifting his poetic imagination from dried wells to large pools, from dried wadis and wells to large pools and running streams, from sturdy camels to beautiful horses, from pitched tents to vast palaces, Al-Buhturi not only transformed Arabic poetry, but also opened up venues for interaction between poetry and architecture. Even then, having said that, the concept of transience, كل من عليها فان, and remains, and regardless of the size and magnificence of human creations in Samarra, their absence or the dominance of the dahr will always be there for these constructions to vanish before the eternity of God. In fact, al-Buhtari himself witnessed the decline and abandonment of Samarra. The question is, why did Arabic imagination suddenly become tethered to the physical setting? And why did that take place in Abbasid Baghdad? I think that remains to be answered as far as I know, although Julie Scott Maisami has taken a very good shot at it. I think there's little question that the actual magnificence of the physical setting and also the changing self-image of the patron were instrumental to this transformation. As settlements and garrison towns grew into vast palaces and watered gardens, and as the image of the caliph came to encompass his palatial creations, the poets seem to have followed suit. I hesitate to move to Medina al-Zahra, which is, before I do that, there is, because we have someone who's knows a lot more about it here than I do, our next speaker. Nevertheless, I think Samarra, the image of Samarra reverberated throughout the Islamic world, from the Lashkari Bazaar in Afghanistan all the way to Spain. But in particular, especially true in Spain, where at Medina al-Zahra, whose foundation almost postdates Samarra by about a century and nearly lasted approximately as long, I think we have definite resonances of what we saw in Samarra. Here also we see the idea of the cruciform channels of the palace presiding over over pools and intersecting channels, but done in different materials, different aesthetic, and with really different attention to the landscape. It is consciously modeled after Samarra, but it's not a mere copy by any sense of the word, rather an interesting mix of forms and ideas derived equally from local geographic conditions, building traditions, and kind of a yearning for the culture of the East. Compared to the palaces of Samarra, those of Medina al-Zahra appear less formal and more intimate and better integrated with the landscape. As you see, it's situated on a series of terraces, 3 terraces with its main pavilions anchoring these terraces, often a pavilion with a body of water in front of it. The Salon Rico, which is this one, the best preserved of these palaces, and I have the next image shows a better view of it, although this image, for whatever reason, no, there's still some more. I will come to that. But I show you this to just give you an idea of how this idea of terracing, of this human-made terracing in Samarra was replicated or attempted to be replicated in Medina al-Zahra, although there they used the natural landscape. Nevertheless, this image of dominance of the landscape, of this, what I think is a positive and optimistic image of rulership is projected in this palace. This is the one, this is completely reversed. It's flipped over. Nevertheless, it gives you an idea of the terracing, and this is the Salon Rico, and this is the pavilion that is in front of it, which would have been originally surrounded by 4 water tanks, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is the Salon Rico, this basilical hall that opens through 5 arches to a pool, and then a smaller, as if a mirror image of it, or a smaller version of it, is located in the middle, and it is also surrounded by 4 pools, giving the impression of almost a pavilion on an island, an image that we will see, or composition that we'll see several times in later Islamic gardens. I think one can say that, now let me go back, by the late 10th century, early 11th century, most of the basic forms of Islamic gardens seem to have taken a definitive form. The use of terracing, the 4-fold garden with water channels, the basilical pavilion facing a water tank, the freestanding pavilion that is open on all four sides to water and gardens. So what is so different about the medieval period, and why have I made something of a big deal about it? And I would like to suggest something that by the 12th century, a different aesthetic seems to emerge. And as I shall argue, it is accompanied by a different poetic ethos. It would take us too far afield to try to isolate the precise political and cultural factors that contributed to this medieval transformation. Beyond the far more limited resources of the petty dynasties of the Middle Ages, which is directly reflected in the smaller gardens and estates and water resources, I think the most decisive factor was citadel culture. After the 12th century, every city in the Islamic world, from India to Spain, becomes a citadel city, a fortified city where the palace is no longer in these vast sprawling estates, but is located in any of these rather constricted spaces, elevated spaces that we call citadels or fortresses. As this happens, there was a necessary diminution in the size and luxury of the palaces, which, as I have shown elsewhere, where on the average, the palaces of the medieval Islamic dynasties were on the average about 1/50th the size of early Islamic predecessors. But citadel culture also made it necessary to utilize hydraulic devices to raise water to high places, a point that I will take up later. At this point, I would like to look at the end product of these hydraulic accomplishments, their celebration by means of elaborate chutes and fanciful fountains. Although some of these garden features may have been used earlier, this is precisely the point when they become quite commonplace in the Islamic world. One of the most interesting, and this is in the citadel of Aleppo, of these features is the Salsabil and Shadowrun fountain, which typically consists of a water spout, sometimes with a lion's head. It falls down. There would have been a panel here, usually called the Shadowrun, carved marble panel. It would have flowed through a stream. This is a wrong reconstruction. It would have flowed through a stream that's partly open, partly hidden, and then it would often emanate in the middle as a spurting fountain. As we'll be looking at a number of these salsabils and shadowruns, but I would like to propose to you that the ways that these devices celebrate and also control the movement of water in a way that encapsulates, for me, three features of Islamic fountains. First, and you'll see this better when there's water in them, is the alternating stillness and movement of water. Second is that it's temporarily solid and sculptural appearance, and then it begins solid and sculptural, and then it becomes sort of, as water does, it becomes more malleable, as opposed to its malleable nature. And also water is used almost as a veil, as a precious material over stone. So this is one of the first examples, not the earliest, but the first that I'm showing from about 1200 in the Aleppo citadel. This is another one in Diyarbakir, which I've never been able to see in person. So this is from a publication, and as you see, water would have come here, flowed down on this, in this case, not quite marble, some kind of a stone, shadowrun, and then it ended up in this decorative pool. The image or the idea of this of the Shadowrun fountain is also known. It makes its way to the Normans of Sicily, and I'll show you here the famous Laziza Pavilion, which was one of a number of pavilions that that were built by the Norman rulers William I and William II between 1166 and 1189. It was actually part of a large extramural series of pavilions that they called actually Genoward, Jannat al-Ard, I would say. It's the corruption of the, in Italian version of the Arabic term, Jannat al-Ard. There's undoubtedly the form, not so much, perhaps some of the formal features of the palace, but I'm not going to deal with that. The Shadowrun Salsabil fountain on the inside is clearly related to what we have seen, and this is a drawing of it, which shows the water at the time still flowing down this Shadowrun into a series of smaller pools. It vanishes and it reappears, and it finally makes its way all the way to a fairly large pool in the middle, in front of the pavilion, and the pool itself has a smaller pavilion in the middle of it. Salsabil fountains must have been fairly common in Norman Sicily, and I think that's evidenced by their depiction, the depiction of one such fountain in the paintings of the Palatine Chapel in Palermo. And they're also referred to by contemporary Sicilian poets. As you see, this painting shows two male musicians on either side of a quadrilobed pool with a jet in the middle, with water sprouting from it. And the water is coming from this lion's head, and it clearly flows down a Shadowrun. The compressed perspective makes them as if they're all leaning against the wall. But in fact, I believe this is almost is meant to show that there are some distance from this from the Shadowrun, and between them there would have been a series of water chutes and channels, such as this one. In fact, there are a couple of lines of poetry, one by Al-Buthayri, Al-Siqilli, Al-Buthayri of Butera, and in it he says, "And the lions of its Shadowrun spout Kawthar-like waters." I don't have the translation of that. ومياه الشادروان, something like مياه كوثرية تصب على الشادروان, something like that. I don't have the exact Arabic poem with me. In fact, the poetry of the most famous Sicilian poets, Ibn Hamdis, who died in 1132, contains a number of references to Shadowruns and other fountains that were found in the palaces of the Hammadids and the Norman princes. He describes, in his description of the palace of Al-Mansur at Bougie or Bijaya, mentions pools into which water pours from mouths of birds, giraffes, and lions. One of the lines is, the poems is, its waters are like ingots of silver, which melt on the steps of a Shadowrun. This is another reconstruction of the gardens that, as they would have once existed. And again, you see the idea of this concept of this image of the pavilion, and it's almost a small pagoda-like structure in the middle of the island, to which they would take a little boat and perhaps, I don't know, spend some time in it. Yes, and the fountains were very often shaped, as they are today, into a variety of animals, but most commonly it's the lion. Why the lion? According to the poets, it is because the lion is such a fierce and fearsome creature, and by having water enter into it, often from its behind and coming out of its mouth, it's an image of power. Power is harnessed. Power, the powerful image of the lion is made to be subject to the wills of the patron. This is from Ma'albak, actually. It's not so much a water fountain, but it is a gutter spout. This is in the Louvre. This is the one we saw. And this is just a modern fountain someplace in Lebanon. As I was looking at some of these palaces and pavilions that were built in the 12th and 13th century, Outside of citadels, here we have the citadels with their palaces, but we know that the Ayyubids, the Artukids, and others also built pavilions, jawasiq, plural of jawsaq, outside of the city in extramural settings. And very often they precisely located these pavilions at a spring. What could be more natural? So as I was traveling in Lebanon recently, it occurred to me that these palaces are really little more than a water gate, than a way of elaborating, building upon a natural phenomenon, which could be as simple as this: a water spout, a mizrab al-ayn, this is a pun on a song by Fairuz, I believe, Ya Kasir Mizrab al-Ayn. But whether we look at this or just water coming out of this, there's something miraculous about this natural phenomenon that, especially in Syria and in Lebanon and in Palestine and Bilad al-Sham, I don't know the other places as well, it just, I don't know, it meant something. It meant something miraculous, spiritual, and healing, curative. And I think by locating a palace on it, of course, you need water to have the palace, but I think all these associations that I mentioned also played into the location of some of these pavilions, of which this one is almost a unique survival. It's in outside of Mardin, called Qasr al-Firdaus, again a term redolent with meaning, and it's placed on, according to the historians, on Ayn al-Tuti, the Mulberry Spring, datable to about 1220, if not a little earlier. What is it? It's a series of iwans. You see the mountain right behind it. I'm sure there was a spring there. The spring, the iwan, these palaces were built right at the source of the gushing point of the spring, the opening point, and the water flows into it. It's distributed into 3 channels for 3 iwans. It flows down this cascade like a Shadowrun, although here the water looks a little like sand. But as you see, the same idea of the partly open, partly closed, the hidden source of water, its solid and malleable nature are all studied here. And it ends into the cistern, which is what you see here. So this is a palace or a jawsaq that was built by the Artukids in about in the 1220s. I think the succession of the pools, the use of partly open, partly covered channels, indeed the whole composition of pavilions clearly reflects what we've seen in Laziza Palace in Palermo. There are actually just in the Museum of Cairo in Kuwait, there are a number of these Shadowrun slabs which were taken from different madrasas and palaces. This one is, I think, 15th century. I think this is a version of the Shadowrun made into a, although I don't know the date of it, it could be very late. But at least this one is datable to the Mamluk period. What I'm saying is that they once existed in fairly large quantity. At this point, the synchronicity between the text and the images are not quite where I would like them to be. However, I have here images of different fountains that ideally should be accompanied with the right poetic text, which is not the case here, but I will show them to you anyway. One of the favorite images of the poets that they use is how water rises like a rod of rock crystal, and it almost appears that it is solid, and then suddenly, of course, water can only rise so far as an apparently solid substance, and then it cascades down, breaks apart, and that's supposed to sort of, as often the case, to illustrate, to resonate with the theme, with the passage of all human creations. Water is made to overflow the rim of a fountain. I think Muhammad al-Asad showed us that the water devices in Islamic gardens were often maximized the presence of this rather limited resource. So this is actually a very shallow pool, but the fact that it overflows in this manner is often compared to the hand of the generous man, the Al-Karim, who dispenses with money at ease. Or this image, which I recently took from a book. There were other types of fountains that I think resonate, that have something to do with the idea of the Shadowrun, which is fountains like this. I realize that this one is most likely post-Islamic, and this one is located in Palermo, out of all places. But it's sometimes called the Arab fountain. Whether it is or not is not really the point. However, I know from descriptions of Ibn Jubair, who traveled in Syria in the 1180s. He describes an almost identical fountain in a madrasa outside of the mosque, the great mosque of Damascus, where he specifically talks about how the passage of water is artfully hidden in a column, so you don't see how the water is coming. And then it suddenly spurts out from the top in this kind of miraculous manner, at least to him. So this idea of, I think, resembles the 12th century fountain, which is located in the southwestern corner of the cloister of the Norman Cathedral at Monreale. And I think the chevron pattern, well, it could be Islamic, I'm not really sure. Once again, I hesitate to talk about the Alhambra. However, I just want to make the point that after all, the Alhambra is a citadel, qal'a. For the Arabs, it's qal'at al-Hamra. And for that reason, despite the fact that it is the jewel of all Arabic Islamic foundations, gardens, it is in the end located in an elevated space, and it was important, imperative, as Dr. Ruggles has demonstrated, to bring water to it, and that the transportation of water to it was a huge feat that we only see sort of the fruit of this huge feat in terms of the fountains that are inside it. Formally speaking, it has the same ideas that we've seen before of a pavilion facing a huge tank of water, a different type of garden with the cruciform channels, and many of the same ideas of the running water in thin channels. As far as I know, there are no Shadowruns in it, but some of the same ideas, but really explored and developed at a much higher refined aesthetic sense. Even the most famous of them, the Court of the Lions, with its water channels, elaborates and builds up on ideas that we've seen before. But it's not a question of striding originality, but a question of a development, refinement over a long period of time. Poets were especially fond of dwelling on the use of water in fountains like this, whether in Shadowruns or the way they ran in the streams of water in these constricted channels, often comparing water to molten silver, rock crystal, lapis lazuli, or a tin-plated mirror of glass. Ibn Zamrak's lines describing the water in the courtyard of the Lions are quite telling in this regard. He says, "Silver melting, which flows between jewels, one like the other in beauty, white in purity. A running stream evokes the illusion of solidity for the eye so that we wonder which one is fluid. Don't you see, it's the water which is running over the rim of the fountain, whereas it is a structure which offers channels for the water flow. Clearly, we have traveled a long distance between this type of poetry, which dwells on the physicality of water, from where we started early on with the weeping by the ruins. Now, in most cases, gardens were placed on a gentle slope with water source at the highest point, running gently down this slope. But at times, it was necessary to raise water. And there were, I would like to speak briefly about water elevating devices, the na'ura, which raises water, but by the force of a running stream. Therefore, it was only possible, the water dips into these compartments and raises it. It was only possible, with streams of this type. But there were other devices that were used for example, this one, which is illustrated in Maqamat al-Hariri. A simplified saqiya is used where the water dips and discharges. Or a more typical saqiya with two intermeshing gear systems that raise the water higher. Or one of the most visionary and complicated of them all, I'm not sure this actually existed or were ever used. It was more of a mechanical device that I tried to explain here by adding the legend to it, and there's no time really to explain it. But the basic idea of it is, by artfully hiding the mechanism, it appears that water is elevating itself. It almost appears like a machine of perpetual motion that is being driven by the wooden bull, by the image of a wooden bull. All these wondrous devices, I think, resonates and were part of the aesthetic of these gardens. One, let me see. I'll come to the end of this. Yes, I'm actually using this to, there's a beautiful passage that describes a palace in a lake that was constructed, I think, towards the beginning of the 12th century, where the patron, Al-Ma'mun, constructed a qubba of stained glass encrusted with gold, and water was made to rise to the top of this qubba. So you have the image of glass and gold and stained glass, water rising from the top, and he would sit in the middle and be completely surrounded by this image of water. That does not exist, but this is the closest that I could come to it. This idea of being completely encompassed, drenched practically, within the sensuous atmosphere of the garden, but without actually walking into it. I wanted to say something about the idea of paradise as a construction, and I will basically summarize by saying that, yes, early on, everybody saw, and anyone who reads about about Islamic gardens, the image of paradise immediately comes to mind. And then others have completely rejected it and preferred looking at gardens in terms of agronomy, in terms of hydraulics, in terms of imperial willpower. I'm saying that it is not really necessary to completely dismiss such a central and important concept, and we should think of paradise as a social construction. Yes, it has a kind of a basic image that is constructed in the Quran, but in different periods it was projected and seen differently. Here is a literal depiction of paradise. Over here is an actual garden. And then after a point, the image of the quadripartite garden controlled water channels that have Persian origins come to dominate. So let's think of paradise as the a priori, as the original schema in Gombrickian terms, and then every culture and every society introduces to it certain corrections to to make it more central to their concerns. One also notices as we look at a whole series of Islamic gardens, really the constancy, the persistence of forms. They're huge at some point, and they become much smaller, but there is definitely a persistence of forms, a sense of decorum that really runs through much of Islamic gardens, dwelling on the beautiful, on the sensuous, on the limpid, on the regular, and shunning the grotesque, the torrential, and I would like to get back finally to a question that was raised by yesterday by Oscar about why is it whether Islamic poetry or Islamic gardens encompass or deal with the idea of the grotesque, the unexpected, the torrential, the ugly, and in fact they don't. There's an absence of, as one would expect, of the idea, the aesthetic of the sublime, the liminality of the grotesque, the beauty of extreme, of extreme things, or the beauty of ugliness, if you will, which becomes a central feature in European art after a point. In fact, it's only after the first poets, the poets of the beginning of the 20th century, when they come in contact with Europe, Ahmad Shawqi, for example, it's only then, doesn't quite illustrate it, but it's only then, having come in contact both with European poetry and with water used in quite unexpected ways, that they begin to poeticize about such things as the torrential rains, floods, unexpected rivers, so on. In as much as possible, Islamic garden and Islamic poetry shunned these ideas. We don't have a single poem, as far as I know, medieval poem about the great Euphrates, for example, or the Tigris. I might be mistaken. There are relatively few that speak about the Nile or the cataracts of the Nile, but there are hundreds of poems that speak about these beautiful streams that we discussed that are within gardens. So they lived within a world of rather well-defined decorum that I believe defined and resonated between poetry and gardens. Thank you.